Good morning, everyone. I'm today's MC, Yanjiu, from the Department of History and a member of the NUS Buddhist Studies Group. So thank you for joining today's book panel discussion co-organized by NUS Libraries, NUS Department of History, and the NUS Buddhist Studies Group. This event is part of the Researcher Unbound class workshop under the Roots and Reflection series. Research Unbound class programs are designed to cultivate vibrant dialogues and networks and foster a collaborative environment to share insights. Today, the topic of our talk is 9 Cities Dharma, Tracing Buddhism in Singapore. This panel discussion will focus on Associate Professor Jack Chia's newly published Chinese book, 东南亚法音，新加坡佛教研究论集. Southeast Asia's Dharma, Essays on Buddhism in Singapore. So a collection of essays exploring Buddhism in Singapore. The discussion will examine how Buddhism in Singapore has developed within the broader socio-political landscape, with particular attention to Buddhist migration, transnational Buddhist networks, and religious diplomacy after the country's independence. By situating Buddhism in Singapore within regional and global frameworks, the panel will discuss how Buddhist institutions, teachings, and practices have contributed to shaping the nation's multicultural and multireligious society. Today's moderator is Associate Professor Latali Pang. She is University Librarian at NUS Libraries and head in the Department of Communications and New Media and the NUS. She is also a researcher and educator in digital citizenship and digital humanities. Her research lies at the intersection of technology and society, and her research projects are organized under the themes of digital citizenship, digital inclusion and well-being, and digital heritage. Prof Pang will give a welcome speech and moderate the panel discussion. So Prof Pang, may I please turn the session over to you?
Pleasure to see everyone here today, and thanks for joining us this Wednesday afternoon. So on behalf of NUS Libraries, I'm really happy to be here to welcome all of you to this panel discussion titled Lion City Dharma, Tracing Buddhism in Singapore. We're delighted to see such a wonderful gathering of colleagues, students, and friends who are actually interested in this common interest of the study of Buddhism, Chinese religions, and Southeast Asian history. So this event highlights the important role that scholarship plays and continues to play in deepening our understanding of the region's rich religious and cultural traditions. On the note of roots and reflection, right? This is our workshop series at NUS Libraries, and this series is focused on actually in the form of seminars, workshops, and talks to explore and allow our audiences to explore the rich tapestry of Southeast Asian history and cultural heritage, essentially to foster deeper understanding of our shared and diverse heritage and evolving cultural identities, as also documented and developed it through our connections. So it is my honor here this afternoon to welcome 3 distinguished speakers who will be addressing all of you today. First is Associate Professor Jack Chia, who is Full-High Associate Professor in Buddhist Studies at the National University of Singapore and Assistant Dean of Research at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So Jack is a leading historian of religion in Southeast Asia, and his award-winning book, Monks in Motion, received the 2021 EuroC's Humanities Book Prize and has been translated into Chinese and Indonesian. Today, he will be presenting his newly published book, which we saw just a moment ago. This is his second book, Southeast Asia Dharma, Essays of Buddhism in Singapore. Professor Hua Kun Eng, adjunct professor at NUS Department of Chinese Studies, is renowned for her research on Chinese diaspora, reformist Buddhism, philanthropy, and community trust. Her prolific publications include Ancestor Worship in the Diaspora of Chinese and China Overseas, Universe, right, and the social production of Buddhist compassion in Chinese society. The third speaker we have is Associate Professor Tong Lee, of Zhengzhou University, formerly with NTU and Seoul National University, and he brings deep expertise in Southeast Asian history, maritime trade, Chinese religions, and comparative diasporas. His diverse academic journey and research interests enrich today's discussion on regional and global connections. We're grateful that Prof Ko, currently in China, is joining us via Zoom to share his commentary. So as you can see, and I hope you also understand why I'm a bit starstruck today, right? Because all three are very well-known and distinguished scholars in their own rights. So please join me in giving all three speakers a warm welcome. I'd like to start with Associate Professor Jack Chia, right? Also a great friend of mine, and his contributions to the study of Buddhism in Southeast Asia. Prof Chia's research journey began with his doctoral dissertation. I still remember when you started, right? Diaspora, Dharma, Buddhism, and Modernity across South China Sea, right? And this is a work that is accessible in our collection that you can actually find more about and read more about, right? And this work really laid the groundwork for his pioneering exploration of transnational Buddhism. His first book, Monks in Motion, Buddhism and Modernity Across South China Sea, was published in 2020. So the book brought impact, right? I think it's quite evident in the way it has actually been translated into Indonesian, right, in 2022, and also Chinese in 2024. In Monks in Motion, Prof Chia presents a compelling history of what he calls, quote here, South China Sea Buddhism. Buddhism that's shaped by correspondence networks, forced exiles, voluntary visits, evangelizing missions, institutional building campaigns, and the organizational efforts of countless Chinese and Chinese diasporic monks. And the book was awarded, right, very well deserved, the 2021 Euroseas Humanities Book Prize, and was shortlisted for the 2023 Frederick Weller Prize. So this year, Prof Chia published his second book, Dongnanya Fa Yin, Xinjiapo佛教研究论集, Southeast Asia Dharma, Essays of Buddhism in Singapore, which is a collection of essays that continues to examine transnational networks, right? Religious diplomacy, and the rise of modernist Buddhist practices in Singapore, which is really current and relevant to all of us today, right? His interdisciplinary and multidimensional approach provides a nuanced understanding of Buddhism development in maritime Southeast Asia. So currently, Prof Chia is also completing an edited volume, Figures of Buddhist Diplomacy in Modern Asia, comprising 22 chapters of monastic, lay, and political figures who have shaped Buddhist diplomacy from early 20th century to today. And this work, as I understand, is supported by the Social Science Research Council, Singapore 2020 Social Science and Humanities Research Fellowship. So he is also working on the forthcoming monograph, right? Budayana, right? The making of an Indonesian Buddhist movement, which will further illuminate interconnected histories of regional Buddhist communities. So yeah, I don't know where you find all this time. It's quite many minutes for me to just reach out what you're working on. But yeah, before I begin the panel and invite Jack to start his sharing on his book, I'd like to also note that today's event is part of two significant milestones we are celebrating at NUS and Singapore. So Singapore's SG60 celebrations and the National University of Singapore 150th anniversary. So these occasions remind us of the enduring value of scholarship and community in shaping our nation's cultural and intellectual landscape, right? Which is why works like what Jack is and Prof and Prof Ko are doing so important. And these occasions, I think, also remind us of the enduring value of scholarship and community, right? And making sure that these works continue to be accessible to the public and community, right? And their role in shaping our nation's understanding cultural and intellectual scholarly works, right? Our library is very proud to be host, right, to such a rich and growing collection of Buddhism in Singapore and Southeast Asia. And these collections really serve as a very vital resource, not just for researchers, but also students, visiting scholars as well, and the wider public. So events like this afternoon, not only spotlight outstanding scholarship, but also our commitment to preserving and sharing the region's religious and cultural heritage. So I'm sorry for taking so many minutes. Right? It's a long list of things to read. Right? With this introduction, I'd like to actually invite Jack to the stage, right, to share a summary of his book and his insights behind his book. So, Jack, please.
Very good afternoon, everyone. And I want to start by thanking Professor Leslie Pan for the extremely kind and generous introduction. And many thanks to my dear friends and colleagues at the NUS Library, especially Chai Kim and Gambi, for making this event possible. So thank you so much for doing all this. Right? And I also want to thank my dear friends, Professor Kwa Kun Eng and Professor Ho Kim Wei for serving as the discussants for my book discussion. And Professor Ko, unfortunately, is away in Henan, where he will be interviewing for the new position for the advert of Shaolin Shi. I'm just kidding. But he'll be joining us soon, right? So yes. So without further ado, I'm going to share with you a quick summary of my book, Southeast Asia's Dharma Essays on Buddhism in Singapore. It was published in Chinese, 东南亚法音 新加坡佛教研究论集. And this book was actually a series of research articles published over the years, over the last 50 years. So I've been working on the history and development of Buddhism for some time. And 2 years ago, I was invited by a Taiwanese publisher, Ouyang Wenhua, as you can see over here, and they have a series of they have a book series, 宗教学者经典 on classics by religious studies scholars, and they were actively approaching scholars of Chinese religions to contribute to the series. So they published a series of books known as 自选集 or self-collected essays to be published in this book series. So over the last few years, they're published by books by distinguished scholars in the Greater Chinese region, including, for instance, Professor Paul Katz of Kangbao and Professor Li Yuzhen, as well as Professor Kan Zhenzhong. So they are the leading scholars in the study of Chinese Buddhism, but also Chinese Taoism and religions in the Greater Chinese region. So I was very honored and I was in fact very excited when they first approached me to contribute to this book series, and they were really interested to have a book on Southeast Asian Chinese religion. So 东南亚法音 was published as the first book on Southeast Asian religion in this book series, and also they are really looking forward to have more contributions and looking forward to publish more books on this area, religion in Southeast Asia. So I really look forward to seeing more books published in this series. So this book was actually a collection of my essays. So I usually publish my works in English. So this book actually contains 11 essays that I have written over the last 15 years, and most of these essays were in English. A few were actually in Chinese. So my graduate students, and my postdoc advisee, Dong Wei Kai, are you here today? Wei Kai. Yes, Wei Kai, and my postdoc advisee Wang Sisi translated the chapters for me. So I'm really grateful to them for their support in also making this book accessible to a Chinese audience, right? So this book was actually written in Singapore's Dharma, written for our Channel 8 audience, but most of the articles were originally for the Channel 5 audience. So if you're interested in the English original essays, please feel free to email me, and I'm happy to send these chapters and journal articles to you. So this book actually, the main focus of this book can be divided into three main themes, right? First, on religious networks, as Professor Pang mentioned earlier. I've been working on Buddhist connections between the Greater Chinese region, including mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and the Buddhist community in maritime Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And the term I coined in my research is South China Sea Buddhism, which actually the term that I coined to consider the kind of connected history and the Buddhist connections between the East Asia, the Greater Chinese region, and the Buddhist community in Southeast Asia. And this book can be divided mainly into three themes, as I mentioned. So first, on the Buddhist connections and networks. Second, on Buddhist diplomacy, which is the project that I'm currently working on. So I received a grant from the Social Science Research Council a few years ago to work on this project on Buddhist diplomacy. And this book contains two chapters on Buddhist diplomacy between China and Singapore. And finally, the last few chapters of my book is on Buddhist modernism, another theme that I've been working on over the last decade. And I owe a lot to Professor Kwa Kun Ing for her groundbreaking book on reformist Buddhism that actually informed my work on Buddhist modernism in the Singapore context. So my research aims to examine the diverse development of Buddhism, especially in the maritime Southeast Asian region. And by doing so, I hope to inspire further research on Buddhism in this region and to reconsider this term Southeast Asian Buddhism. And why is this so? Because when we think about Buddhism in Southeast Asia, most scholars actually examine this region. And in Southeast Asian studies, Southeast Asia is usually divided into two regions, right? We have mainland Southeast Asia over here, from South Thailand all the way up to include Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And this region over here, which is in the south, which includes Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, Singapore, and the Philippines, is considered maritime Southeast Asia. And when scholars of South Asian Buddhism, when they look at Buddhism, they usually examine the mainland South Asian region, which is the Theravada Buddhist majority region. And Vietnam, which is a very interesting case, even though Vietnam has a Buddhist majority population, most Vietnamese Buddhists actually practice Mahayana Buddhism, which is similar to the form of Buddhism in East Asia, in mainland China, Korea, and Japan. So maritime Southeast Asia is often a region that's neglected because maritime Southeast Asia is a Muslim majority region. In fact, Indonesia has the world's largest Muslim population, and the Philippines has a Catholic majority population. So when we look at this region, right, it's actually not a Buddhist majority region, with the exception of, interestingly, Singapore. So Singapore is kind of an anomaly in the maritime South Asian context because Singapore not only has a Buddhist majority population, but also has an ethnic Chinese population in the maritime South Asian region. So my book is divided into 12 chapters. It starts with a short introductory chapter with my academic journey, and also it elaborates my journey into the study of Buddhism in maritime Southeast Asia. And it contains 11 chapters of my 11 articles, my previously published articles, both in English and in Chinese. So I'm not going to go through them right now because I will very quickly summarize each chapter very quickly and to share them with you. So my book starts with the first chapter, Diaspora's Dharma, or Li San Fayin, that actually examines the role of Xiamen in the South China Sea Buddhist networks. And Xiamen is a very important key port for maritime trade, and that was also where my maternal grandmother came from. So this place, Xiamen was a very important port city and was a major hub for Chinese migration. And Chinese migration contributed to the spread of Chinese Buddhism from South China in the Fujian region to Southeast Asia. And one of the very important monasteries in Xiamen was the Nanputuo Monastery. And quick show of hands, anyone here into the Nanputuo Monastery? Yeah, I see Prof. Yeah, but anyone have been to Xiamen University? Oh, yes. Yeah. So, in fact, the Nanputuo Monastery is just located just right next to the Xiamen University. And in fact, it's one of the most important Buddhist monasteries in South China. And the Nanputo Monastery was a very important institution for Buddhist reform during the Republican period. And one of the very important monks at the time was actually the abbot Venerable Huiquan, who actually founded the Minnan Buddhist Institute or Minnan Fojiao. And Minnan Buddhist Institute was a very key educational institution in South China during this time and produced a generation of Buddhist educators and reformers. And one of the very prominent leaders and teachers of the Minnan Buddhist Institute was the Buddhist reformer, Tai Xu, and Buddhist people call him Master Tai Xu or Tai Xu Da Si, who became the abbot and the rector of the Minnan Buddhist Institute in 1927. So during this time, the Buddhist community in South China, in Fujian, was actively raising funds across the sea to develop the Buddhist reform movement, but also to expand Buddhist education in South China. So, for instance, one of the very prominent monks during this time, Venerable Xi Chan, he made trips to Singapore and Malaya to raise funds for temple restoration projects in Xiamen, but also in Fujian more broadly. And also in 1926, Master Tai Xu actually made his first visit to Singapore to raise funds and also to promote his ideas of human life Buddhism or racial fojiao. So when Tai Xu came to Singapore in 1926, he actually gave a series of lectures, guess where? At the Victoria Memorial Hall. So now when you think about the Victoria concert, right, we usually go there for the concerts by the Singapore Symphony Orchestra. I imagine that about 100 years ago, it was a very important place for lectures, right? The Master Tai Xu was actually giving a series of lectures at the Victoria Memorial Hall. And he was able to gain a lot of support from the wealthy Taoists, right, in Southeast Asia. And many of these wealthy Taoists, including overseas Chinese leaders such as Dang Ha-Ki and Ao Wen-Ho, they were actually making contributions to China, right, during this time. And in fact, Dang Ha-Ki and Ao Wen-Ho also supported Buddhism, right? Even Ao Wen-Ho himself and his brother Ao Wen-Pao, they were very prominent Buddhists, and they actually contributed to the construction of Buddhist monasteries. So they made very generous donations to Tai Xu and his colleagues who came to Singapore to raise funds. Next chapter, the Lion City's Dharma offers an overview of offers a brief history of Chinese Buddhism or Hanchuan Fojiao in Singapore. So I started this chapter with the arrival of Raffles, even though Raffles has absolutely nothing to do with the promotion of Buddhism. But the arrival of Raffles, and after Singapore became a colonial port city, he actually brought Chinese migrants from Fujian and Guangdong to Southeast Asia, and those Chinese migrants included my grandparents. So they came from Fujian to Guangdong to find better livelihood in Singapore. So as they migrated from South China to Singapore, they brought with them what was known as folk Buddhism. Many scholars consider folk Buddhism or yanjiu fojiao to Southeast Asia. And this form of early folk Buddhism actually was a kind of what scholars considered as the unity of the three teachings, right, or Sanjiao Heyi. So many of them are kind of Buddhists. They will go to pray at the Buddhist temple, they will pray to Guan Yin. They also pray to Taoist deity like Taishan Laochi, Ma Chu, and others, as well as practice the Chinese Confucian kind of practice of ancestor worship, right? So very often if you look at the kind of Chinese altar, you will see Guan Yin or Buddha, Chinese deities, and the ancestor pattern right, next to it. So the kind of mixed form of Buddhist practice, right? A lot of them will say, I am Buddhist, but they will tell you that I fight for, right? I pray to Buddha. And they have very little knowledge of the Dharma because their focus wasn't exactly on learning about the Dharma, but they were actually more interested, right? They were actually looking more on blessings and protection in a new homeland, right? In a new place. So by the late 19th and the early 20th century, we saw the rise of institutional, or what scholars consider as quote-unquote Orthodox Buddhism, and that was the term that the Buddhist community was also using, like the term 正信佛教. And this emerged during the late 19th and earlier 20th century, where we see the construction of Buddhist monasteries, right? And in the Singapore context, we have, for instance, the Shuangling Monastery and the Gongmeng San Togasi monasteries, right? So these are good examples of the rise of institutional Buddhism by the beginning of the 20th century. So the question to ask is, who are the Buddhists in Singapore, right? And this is a question that that really influenced the very early scholarship on the study of Buddhism in Singapore. And one of the very important pioneering work, right? In fact, to think about Buddhism in Singapore, right? One way to look at it is actually through the census, right? That we look at statistics. And one of the very early census was actually the 1947 census for Malaya and Singapore. And in that early census, and I'm going to share with you later on, that Buddhism and Taoism were not categories in the national census. In fact, they were all, conflated into this broad category known as Chinese national religion. And when I actually talked about Chinese national religion in China a few months ago, right? My Chinese colleagues were actually quite amused. Right? What is Chinese national religion? Really, in a Chinese context, there's no such thing as 华人国家宗教, right? In fact, 华人国家 is actually 共产主义 or communism, right? So definitely it's neither Buddhism nor Taoism, and definitely not Confucianism, right? So it's a kind of confusing term. And I'm going to elaborate on that. But in 1947, the category was Chinese national religion for all Buddhism and Taoism. And a very early work was by Professor Vivian Wee, and she actually published this very early article in 1976 on Buddhism in Singapore. And she argues that to understand Buddhism, and she used Buddhism in quote unquote right, Buddhism, as on the one hand canonical Buddhism, but on the other hand as Chinese religion, right, which is a kind of mix of what, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of unity of our three teachings. And by the 1980s, my dear friend, Professor Hua Kun Ing's very important pioneering book, State Society and Religious Engineering Towards a Reformist Buddhism in Singapore. And in this very important book, she actually argues that by the 1980s and 90s, right, we see a process of Buddhicization of Chinese religious syncretism and a movement towards Reformist Buddhism, where Buddhists would actually started to actually move away from the kind of unity of three teachings, kind of mixed form of folk Buddhism, to practice more of the kind of canonical Buddhism based on the texts and scriptures, but it's also they consider themselves as reformist Buddhists, right? That they are different from the kind of Buddhists that practice Buddhism previously, right? So I'm going to just show you some very interesting statistics. This is from the 1947 census, right? And if you look at 1947 census, right, you also notice something very interesting, right? That during this time, right, then Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, and Sikhism, right, were separate categories, right? But Buddhism and Taoism and Chinese popular religion were all merged into one major category, that's Chinese national religion. But another interesting feature in this category, if you notice that the number of Muslims and the number of Chinese religious followers, right, practitioners are almost the same, right? And this was also one of the reasons, right, for the separation later on, right? When the then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew / Tunku Abdul Rahman, right, over the kind of racial politics, then that eventually led to separation because the number of Chinese was almost the same as the number of Muslims if we combine British, then Malaya and Singapore, right? That was something very interesting to know. Another very interesting thing to look at is the National Census of Population, right? That's the latest 2020, right? That we see that although Buddhism has kind of slightly declined from 2010 from 33.3% to 31.1%, Buddhism remains the religious majority in Singapore. And guess which is the fastest growing religion in Singapore? From the paper. Which may be good, but it's just a small increase. Anyone? No, not Islam. Yes, no religion is the fastest growing religion in Singapore, right? It's a very interesting thing to notice, right? That in fact Singapore is fast becoming a secular. So it also brings back to the theory, right? That's favor raised right, many years ago, right? To think about the secularization theory and to think about that in the Singapore context. All right. So the next chapter, I look at the rise of humanistic Buddhism in Singapore, which I call literally Buddhism or 现世佛教. And humanistic Buddhism, I argue, in the Singapore context, can be divided into three phases, right? To think about. And the first phase, we can look at that in the context of Taishu's human life Buddhism, and I quickly mentioned Taishu earlier. And Taishu, during the Republican period in China, fought for the modernization and revitalization of Chinese Buddhism. And in fact, he actually started a movement known as a Buddhist revival movement, or fojiao to revive Chinese Buddhism in Republican China, right? In the face of Western science and democracy, which was the dominant discourse of the new cultural movement during that time. And Taishu, as I mentioned earlier, was elected as the abbot of the Nanputo Monastery, and he made missionary trips to Singapore, both to propagate the Dharma, but also to fundraise, right? He was actively talking to the wealthy Taoists in Southeast Asia. And in 1927, he actually founded the first lay Buddhist association in Singapore, known as the Singapore Chinese Buddhist Association, or Zhongba Fojiao Hui, which is the topic that Wei Tai is currently working on, was MA thesis. And we are also very fortunate that the Singapore Chinese Buddhist Association donated their huge collection of the documents to the NUS Library, right? So now we are going to have a huge collection, we are going to embark on the, we are going to digitize these documents over the next few years so that we can make that available for more researchers, right? Think about the place of Buddhism in the broader, Chinese Buddhist history. So the second phase that I talked about in my book was about Yan Pei, and Yan Pei promoted what was known as humanistic Buddhism, or Renjian fojiao. And very often we think about humanistic Buddhism today, right? We often associate that idea or concept with the big Taiwanese, what I would consider mega temples, right? Such as Foguangshan and Ciji. So these are important Taiwanese organizations that promoted humanistic Buddhism or Renjian fojiao. But before their arrival in Singapore, actually Yan Pei was actively promoting humanistic Buddhism as well. And Yan Pei was a disciple of Master Taishu, but he was also a student of Master Yingsu, right? And Master Yingsu was a very prominent thinker and Buddhist reformer in Republican China, and he actually moved to Taiwan right after 1949 and established a very vibrant Buddhist community in Hsinchu. So when Yan Pei migrated to Singapore in 1963, he brought with him this idea of humanistic Buddhism, right? And he was very much influenced by Yingsu's idea. And he actually became the abbot of the Lingfeng Prashna Auditorium in 1963. And in 1981, he actually started a Buddhist welfare organization known as the Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services in 1981. And this Singapore Buddhist Welfare Services offer actually support for the elderly. So he actually started a home known as Grace Lodge for the elderly. And subsequently, he actually started a halfway house as well, known as Grace Haven, to support the former drug addicts. Right? So he was actually playing a very important role in promoting Buddhist social welfare in Singapore. And the third phase has a lot to do with the arrival of Taiwanese Buddhist mega temples and the development of Taiwanese humanistic Buddhist group actually played a very important role as well in transforming the religious landscape in the Singapore context. But the first to arrive was actually the Mahaprajna Buddhist Society, a very prominent Buddhist temple in Geylang that probably not that many people know about. It was actually established by Venerable Ho Zong, who was actually a disciple of Yingsun. And that is one of the most prominent educational centers promoting humanistic Buddhism in Singapore. And in 1993, Foguangshan's Buddha-like International Association was established in Singapore. And subsequently, in the year 2000, they were officially registered and then eventually built a very prominent temple structure in Punggol in the northeastern part of Singapore. And in 1993, another very prominent Taiwanese Buddhist organization, Ciji, was also established, and they have established a huge temple in Pasir-Ris in the eastern part of Singapore. And just a few years ago, they started a youth center in Yishun. It's a really huge, very vibrant center where they are trying to promote humanistic Buddhism to the younger generation of Singaporeans. And Defending the Dharma is a chapter that actually looks at the role of the Singapore Buddhist Federation in Buddhist activism. The Singapore Buddhist Federation was established in 1949 and it was during the colonial period. And its main aim was actually to promote over here and to promote world peace, promote the Dharma, expand Buddhist education, carry out welfare activities, and improve the quality of the Sangha. But more importantly, the Singapore Buddhist Federation was also a very important national Buddhist organization to represent the Buddhist community's interests. And in this case, when it was first established in 1949 to the British colonial government, and after that in 1965, right, that the Buddhist Federation plays an important role in promoting the Buddhist interests and also work closely with the Singapore government. So when the Buddhist Federation was first established, it was actually a lay Buddhist who was actually the chairman, and he was actually a chairman for 8 terms, and he was Lee Chun-sing. And Lee Chun-sing was a very prominent, wealthy Tauke, but a very active lay Buddhist in Singapore. And he was now one of the founding members who established the Singapore Buddhist Federation. And in fact, we have some very interesting primary sources. Later, you can take a look at the exhibition on Lee Chun-sing. So Lee Chun-sing, during his term as the chairman, he actually successfully petitioned the British government to recognize Vesak as a public holiday. So now we have a day off thanks to Mr. Lee Chun-sing. And also he obtained permission from the British colonial government to establish a Buddhist dormitory, right? So that he played a very important role in advocating for the interests of the Buddhist community. And by the 1970s, we see a very interesting shift, right? After Lee Chun-sing finished his 8th term, subsequently, only Buddhist monastics, right, became the leaders of the Singapore Buddhist Federation. So after Lee Chun-sing, the next chairman was actually the famous Venerable Hong Jun or Hong Chuan Lao-Sang, who was the abbot of the Dongnanya Monastery, and he was an extremely influential Buddhist leader in Singapore. So from the 1970s onwards, Venerable Hong Chuan and the members of the Buddhist Federation played a proactive role in rallying the Buddhist community to defend their faith and correct religious misrepresentations and misguided practices. So what they did was that they were actively persuading the government to censor foreign films that contain misrepresented Buddhist teachings, right? And some of these films are very interesting, including the South Korean movie Dream, Japanese movie Lefty Fencer, and Hong Kong movie Dongnanya. In fact, those were kind of soft porn kind of films actually that presented Buddhism in a kind of a very bizarre, what they consider religious light, right? So this was what the Buddhist community were very upset about, right? So they were asking the government to censor foreign films, and this was where way before, right, they have an official kind of panel these days, right? That we have colleagues and also members of the religious community that serve on the censorship panel. So before that, right, the religious community had to advocate and persuade the government, right, to censor parts of the film or to ban such films from coming to Singapore. And other than that, the Buddhist Federation was also actively correcting the wrong ideas of Buddhism, including clarifying misconception about the Sangha, the monastic community, but also, for instance, right, responded to newspaper reports, right, or in fact inaccurate reports in the newspaper. For instance, one very interesting example was the newspaper Unbound, right? So they actually responded to Unbound Daily for a misreported article on the Avalokiteshvara of Guanyin, and also a subsequent report that tried to sensationalize a Buddhist scandal, right? So, in fact, if you're following the news, right, in the last couple of months, right, there are many Buddhist scandals, right? Not only the Shaolin Temple in China, but also involve another prominent abbot in Thailand. And of course, the media love to pick on all this, right? So that to increase the readership, right? So these are juicy news. And the Buddhist Federation at the time was actively, right, trying to clarify or to respond, right, to such news reports. So besides that, the Buddhist Federation was also critical of what they consider quote-unquote unorthodox Buddhist practices, including, for instance, right, the spread of Iguan Dao. because Iguantao in Singapore is registered as a Buddhist organization. So this is what the Buddhist community were actively responding to, right? And my colleague, Professor assisting the expert on Iguantao in Singapore. So if you wish to learn more about Iguantao in Singapore, please read his article. And besides the Iguantao, the Buddhist community was also very wary of another group, right, which was actually Falun Gong, which was banned in mainland China. But Falun Gong was not only allowed in Singapore. In fact, Falun Gong was registered as a Buddhist organization, right? In fact, in Singapore, as you can see on the slide, right, they are registered as Falun fojiao, right? So they are a Buddhist education society. But the Buddhist organization and in fact the Buddhist Federation was very upset, and in fact they were protested against the use of the term Buddhism, right, in the registration. Another chapter is actually on Buddhist funeral, and this is a chapter that's quite close to my heart as well, because this was because I actually was a member of a Buddhist recitation group where I actually back in JC, right, back in high school I taught the group. But this is a bit of my in the chapter that is a bit related to my own personal particular observation, but also it ties into what I've written about on the South China Sea Buddhist connection. So for the chapter on Buddhist funerals is very much about Chinese migration as well, and how the Chinese community, right, brought Buddhism to Singapore, but also we saw the inflow of Buddhist monks into Singapore, right, because of the emergence of the Buddhist community. And after the Chinese Buddhists, after they pass away, they actually require monks to conduct the funeral rites for them. So because of that, we saw the rise of Chinese Buddhist funeral rites in colonial Singapore. And many of these funerals were conducted by traveling Buddhist monks, right? So they were actually, many of them were like the sojourners that Professor Wang will talk about, right? They came to Singapore, just like the Chinese migrants, they came actually to make a living. So the traveling monks also came to conduct funeral rites, right? To make money, and then they would bring their funds back to China. So they were not settlers, but many of them were sojourners. And many of these rituals were actually offered by ritual specialists, right? So they were Buddhist monks who knew very little about Buddhism, and their main focus, right, their role was actually to conduct funeral rites. And these monks were actually known as the Xianghua Hesang or Xianghua Shi, right? And sometimes it's translated as the incense flower monks. So their role was actually to conduct the rituals. And many of these rituals were very elaborate during those times, but then gradually, with the rise of reformist Buddhism in Singapore, we also see the rise of reformist Buddhist funerals in Singapore, with the emphasis on canonical Buddhism, which they will recite the Buddhist text, but also a shift in preference for a simplified Buddhist rites, right? So very often, and for Singaporeans, where many of us would stay at HDB, right? So this is something that you might be very familiar with, right? At the board deck, right? That you see sometimes, right? There's different funerals, and at times you see Buddhist funerals like that. And Buddhist funerals that we see today are what is known as simplified Buddhist rites, or the Tianhua Foushi, which are no longer as elaborate as the one that the incense flower monks perform, right? Which included complicated rituals like yanjiu, or like the release of the flaming mouth, or the breaking of the blood bowl ritual, or the post-tribute ritual, right? That I'm not going to go into, but if you're interested, I can share more with you later. I'm not going to perform them. And then with the rise of simplified Buddhist funerals, right, we see the rise of also professional ritual monks, especially. So there are also Buddhist monks that conduct simplified Buddhist rituals, but also recitation assistance group, right? And this is what is known as the 2-mean point. So if for Buddhists who are members of a Buddhist organization, right? So very often if a member from the family passed away, so they would invite the recitation groups from their organization to come and perform the rituals or to dedicate marriage for the family, right? So this is now a common practice that we see in Singapore. And moving on, the next 2 chapters will be on Buddhist diplomacy. So one of the chapters actually looks at the case of Buddhism in Singapore-China relations by focusing on the case of Venerable Hong Chun, or Hong Chuan you see over here. And Venerable Hong Chun, as I mentioned, was the president of the Singapore Buddhist Federation and abbot of the Dongnanya Monastery, and therefore he was a very prominent Buddhist monk in Singapore, to the extent that some Buddhists even claimed that he was like a national advisor to then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew because very often we see in fact Prime Minister Dongnanya at the time actually served as the guest of honor for many of the events of the Singapore Buddhist Federation and the Gongminsan temple, and he was actually known to be actually quite a good friend of Venerable Hong Jun. So between 1982 to 1990, and that was the time before Singapore and China established official relations, Venerable Hong Jun actually made 8 visits to mainland China, to the People's Republic of China. And during this time, in 1982, which was his first visit, he actually led a delegation of 6 Buddhists to China, where he actually met with Zhao Tuchu, the then president of the Buddhist Association of China, which is called 中国佛教协会, the most important national association for the Buddhist community in the PRC, and his wife Chen Banzi. And after the first visit, a year later, he led a 15-man delegation, and this time they arrived in Beijing, where actually they met with the director of the Religious Affairs Bureau, Xiao Yansen. And more importantly, they actually met with the Banchen Lama, who was actually the honorary president of the Chinese Buddhist Association, as well as other prominent Buddhist leaders. So it was actually a very high-profile visit. But the most important visit was actually the 4th visit, where in August 1984, he actually led a 15-man Singapore Gongminsan Pogasi pilgrimage and tour delegation, and they visited China. And this time they met with Wu Lanfu, he met with Wu Lanfu, the China's vice chairman. And I wanted to show this very interesting photo, which is from his 5th visit in 1985, where Venerable Hong Jun again led another trip to China. And this time, he not only went with the Buddhist community, but he invited Singapore's inter-religious organization to join him for the visit. So in fact, the leaders of all the various religious groups actually joined him for this visit when they actually met with Vice Chairman Wu Lanfu at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. And interestingly, my student Ryan was with us today. His grandfather was actually one of the members who joined Venerable Hong Jun on this trip, and he's actually in the photo at the back. So after 6 successful visits, so in 1988, this time around, Venerable Hong Jun invited Zhao Tuchu and the Chinese Buddhist Association this time to visit Singapore. And Zhao Tuchu actually wears many hats. So he was a very prominent calligrapher, a Buddhist leader, but he was actually a politician as well. So he was the vice chairman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Congress, quite a mouthful, or it's a TPPCC, right? So he actually led a 6-man delegation to visit Singapore in 1988. And guess what? He was not only welcomed by prominent Buddhist leaders, including Venerable Hong Jun, Gong Hia, which is Wang Chia, and Xiong Tai, but he actually met with the then 2nd Deputy Prime Minister Ong Teng Cheong and the Minister of State for Community Development, Zhong Zhikun. And Zhong Zhikun is actually also a very prominent Buddhist minister. And also very interestingly, right, all this happened before the official establishment of diplomatic ties in 1990, right? So it's interesting to see the role of Buddhism serving as a kind of informal platform for cultural diplomacy during this time. And in the interest of time, I'm going to speak a bit faster. And moving forward now, the next chapter actually look at the case of Fayin Temple, which is a very prominent Buddhist monastery located in the Fayin town of Xi'an in Shanxi. And Fayin Temple is a very prominent temple because in 1987, the archaeological team actually found a very important object, which is actually the Buddha finger bone relic. And because of that, the temple became not only a very prominent religious site, but also nowadays a very popular tourist attraction, right? So for colleagues who are interested in religious tourism, and this is a very prominent site to look at. So in 2014, and that is after Singapore and China established official diplomatic relations, the Singapore's Asian Civilizations Museum collaborated with the Shanxi Provincial Culturalistics Bureau and the Shanxi Cultural Heritage Promotion Center to curate this exhibition at the ACM in Singapore, which is the secret of the fallen pagoda, treasures from Fayin Temple and the Tan Court. And this exhibition this is the image of the Buddha finger boot relic. So the Chinese Buddhist Parliament Temple, right? This is the relic you see. So the ASEAN collaborated with the Falun Temple, and this was actually not the first overseas exhibition for the Falun Temple. So previously they collaborated with Switzerland, Japan, the UK, the United States, Greece, Hong Kong, and Taiwan to have a series of different exhibitions. And this time around in 2014, they loaned the artifacts to the Asian Civilizations Museum to be exhibited in Singapore, right? And these objects that were loaned to Singapore, it was actually about 120 objects or sets of objects that were, and 24 of them were considered Grade 1 objects, right? And by Grade 1 objects, we are referring to like national treasures, right, in mainland China. So these were the kind of top objects that were loaned to our ASEAN. And the exhibition ran from January 17 to May 4th in 2014, right? So it was around for several months. But more importantly, this event was a very important event because it actually brought together the Singapore political leaders, but also the Chinese leaders as well, right? And the opening event was actually attended by the then Minister of National Development, Khaw Boon Wan, that in fact was a very prominent Buddhist minister, as well as the CEO of the National Heritage Board, as well as the representative from the Shanxi Provincial Cultural Relics Bureau and the Chinese Embassy in Singapore, right? So we see quite a bit of a fanfare, and it actually also demonstrated the use of the Buddhist artifacts in diplomacy between China and Singapore. And this is the book that I'm finishing, which is Figures of Buddhist Diplomacy in Modern Asia, and that interested, this book would be available open access, right? So please, if you're interested, feel free to download a copy. And moving on, the next 3 chapters towards the end are about Buddhist modernism in Singapore, and I'm very much influenced by Professor Kwok's idea of reformist Buddhism. And to further unpack this idea of reformist Buddhism by looking at different case studies in the Singapore context. So one case study I looked at was actually the case of the Buddhist College of Singapore. And Buddhist College of Singapore was established in 2006 and administered by the Dongnanya Progressive Monastery. And this Buddhist college is the first Chinese Mahayana Buddhist college in Singapore. And it has 4 major objectives: to develop talents in monastery and temple management, train Buddhist teachers for Buddhist colleges and temples in Singapore. So it's a bit of the NIE for Buddhist teachers, right? And then also to foster researchers in Buddhist studies. So it also offers in fact a degree program, right? That we collaborate with the Chulalongkorn Buddhist University in Thailand, as well as to educate Buddhist Dharma propagators, right, to teach Buddhism in our local temples. The next case studies I look at is the case of reformist Buddhism in looking at how reformist Buddhism in Singapore tried to repackage the Buddhist faith, right? So, and one very interesting observation is that how many reformist Buddhists were actively working towards removing misconceptions of Buddhism. And one of the most important things they do is try to clear the public confusion of Buddhism as being associated with a form of Taoism. So in fact, many reformist Buddhists do not like the idea of the kind of unity of teachings, but place a lot of emphasis on the kind of canonical and institutional kind of Buddhist teachings. And besides that, they were also playing a very proactive role in promoting their religion by working with Buddhist organizations in Singapore but overseas as well. So we see a lot of Buddhist collaborations as well. And also, this is one of the areas that I'm working on right now, looking at the kind of broader Buddhist collaboration among the so-called reformist Buddhist groups. And one of the very interesting observations as well is that we see many reformist Buddhists using Buddhist music and songs, right, to promote Buddhism in Singapore. So in fact, we have like kind of Buddhist rock bands and kind of Buddhist groups, right, trying to mimic the Christian churches in the promotion of Buddhism. So, and one of the very interesting groups that have emerged in the recent years, right, was actually the Singapore Buddhist Mission. And Singapore Buddhist Mission is actually a kind of a Theravada Buddhist group, but they have been actively promoting youth Buddhism. And in fact, one of the so-called worship leader, the one who plays the guitar, is actually a good friend of mine. When we were actually schoolmates back in NUS, and he's actually his full-time job is actually a scientist, right? So he's I think if I remember correctly, I think chemical or biological engineer, but his free time he actually plays the guitar and sings Buddhist worship songs, right? So very interesting, activities, right? And last but not least, the chapter ends, my book ends with a chapter on cyber Dharma. And I wrote this actually during COVID-19, right? Because like many of you, we didn't have the chance to travel, so we had a bit more time to write, right? So it's a good thing. I mean, COVID wasn't a good thing, but good thing we had a bit more time to write a little thing about the role of the media and the internet, right, in its connection with religion. So in the final chapter of my book, I actually looks at the COVID-19 pandemic and how the Buddhist community celebrated Vesak during the pandemic, and especially in May 2020, which was actually during the circuit breaker, if you remember, right? There was circuit breaker, we couldn't go to work, so we all work from home, right? So it was a very interesting time. And this was an interesting time for the Buddhist community as well, because they had to conduct online blessings and ceremony, the reading of the Buddha ritual, and this is on top over here with a live Zoom Buddha bathing ceremony led by Venerable Wang Ting, right, the president of the Singapore Buddhist Federation. So it was just him bathing the Buddha on Zoom, right? So it's very interesting, the thing about that. And then some Buddhist organizations, including the mega organization I mentioned, for website, just started an online Buddha bathing website to bathe the Buddha. And in fact, if you can go online, you have to look at it. And in fact, it includes a counter, right? So when I actually look at back then, it was 2 years ago when I was finishing this article, there were as many as 4 million clicks, right? So it's an interesting Buddhist click thing, right? You think about it, right? So you can just literally click and paste the thing down, right? On the website. And very interestingly, there was also a Buddhist, the Buddhist community also started a Facebook group as Buddhist United, right? And it's a kind of play of the government's at the time the promotion message called Singapore United, right? At the time, so the Buddhist community came together and started this Buddhist United to promote daily activities that what they thought Buddhists could do, right, during COVID-19, because they couldn't go to temple, so they had a list of 10 things I'm going to show you very soon that the Buddhists can do. But also, I think it's important right now in the post-COVID era to think about the effectiveness of online religious celebration within not only the Buddhist community, but in the broader religious community, right? To think about the kind of connection between religion and also the kind of online platforms, right? So very interestingly, I will show this really quickly. The Buddhist United came up with a list of 10 things that the Buddhists can do during the COVID-19, including bathe the baby Buddha, eat vegetarian meals, shop chanting, light offering, enrich knowledge through Dharma sessions, participate in e-Vesak activities, right? Like those on Zoom, 5-minute meditation, practice generosity through dana, and of course this was very important because many Buddhists couldn't go to temples, so temples would not have an income, right? So you had the online donations. But this is very interesting. Be nice to everyone, especially essential workers. Right? Remember the essential workers, right? Who are still working during COVID-19. And finally, like and share the Buddhist United, right? Very interesting about that. And finally, in conclusion, the book ends with an appendix, right, which is actually my state of the field article on the study of Buddhism in Singapore, which I actually reviewed in existing scholarship. And I pointed out that previous scholarship adopted more of the macro approach, a macro perspective. Most of these books were general accounts of Buddhism in Singapore, and which also included sociological studies, historical studies, and country-specific studies, right, on a particular form of Buddhism, such as, for instance, Thai Buddhism, or, for instance, Chinese Buddhism, right? So I actually argued that we actually need to have a more macro approach to actually think about Buddhism in the Singapore context. And we can also look at leadership and key personalities, religious institutions and organizations, right, as we move forward to study Buddhism in the Singapore context. And with that, I will stop here. And before I end, I'm not going to sell any books today. But if you're interested in the book, this book is available in the NUS Library. I think that the copy that's on the open shelf that's checked out and will be due on October 22nd, which is my brother's birthday, and another copy which is available in the Chinese Library, their South Asia collection. So, and if you're interested in learning more about Buddhism in Singapore, or to check out the Channel 5 articles I mentioned earlier, please feel free to drop me a note. And with that, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. A very enlightening. Because that puts me also on the path of enlightenment. I thought that was super insightful, and I really enjoyed how your discussion of the development of Buddhism help us also understand the intersections with national development, philanthropy, diplomacy, and also identity, right, which is something very current to us. So next we have actually two panelists, Prof Jack and also Prof Wei, who is joining us online. So I must admit that I knew Prof by reputation, good reputation, right? Through her actually really important works, scholarly work in the field. So Prof will be our first discussant, and she will offer her perspectives on how Jack's scholarship contributes to our understanding of reformist Buddhism and Chinese diaspora connections in Southeast Asia. So, Prof, please.
Thank you very much, thank you, Jack. Thank you for the Natalie as well as for inviting me here. I thought Jack did such a wonderful job that my job as a commentator is actually a bit redundant. I mean, he spelled out in great length of this very interesting book that he has written through the years in the articles. So actually, when I was first invited to do this particular commentary, I was wondering, well, reading this book is should be quite easy, right? But then, of course, he packs a lot of things into it. But actually, it reminded me very much of, and I'm going to tell you a little story about myself as well. Like, kind of like 40 years ago, and that was so long, because that really sort of, when he started, when I started reading this book, then he started mentioning my book, and I was like, oh my God, let me start thinking about what I was doing at that time. Just literally 40 years ago, all right? And that was so long ago, gosh. And because when I first decided doing my PhD, that had sort of a bit of a story, was because I was actually looking at the scene at that time that was developing. So Buddhism at that time was very interesting. What I started doing was when I was very young, my mom herself was a kid, right? And when I started driving at the age of 18 or 19 at that time, the first thing she did was say, now you can drive, all right? Drive me to this place, that place. So it's a very interesting aspects to look at. And of course, one of the places that she went was not only to Pokasi, to other temples, but actually to a fojiao. So, I think it still exists. It's called the Qingding, right? And at that time, and I was really puzzled because I was thinking, why specifically that place? Because during those years, there was very, very little Buddhist Dharma teachers, or they call it jianjing, right? And then at that time, they have people from the Taiwanese law will come, and importantly, it's also the language that they were using. I think my mom, we are actually Hokkien speaking, right? And my mom, and of course, when she goes, she doesn't go. When we went, she didn't go on her own, right? We had to go drive, and that's my job. Drive a friend here, a friend there, and then the whole group will go because they all would like to listen to Hokkien vernacular rather than and that kind of stuff. So that was the start of my interest of like, this is really interesting. So when I was doing my PhD, and this is also very interesting, so this is really 真的很巧, when people say, right? Part of the reason was because, in fact, I was thinking of working on, actually that was my second book, on the Qiao Xiang hometown connection between transnational. And when I was at Monash, right, oh, everything was great. Then I was applying for visa to China, such as an anthropological student, right? Because at that time at Monash, a student was arrested when he didn't get a proper visa to go. So you have that proper visa, even though I was saying that I'm a Chinese looking person, I can fit in, right? No. Then I think it was that long, and at that time, I went to the embassy in Singapore. And the guy looked at me and said, "We can't give you a visa because it has to come from the Singapore government." That was what he said. I went to our IRA, and he kind of looked at me and said, "But you're going to China, you should go there. You should ask them, not us." All right. So anyway, nobody's living here. So I went back to Australia, and essentially my supervisor said, "No, you can't go. You do something else. Think of what you want to work out." And of course, this was something that I was actually interested at that time. You know, I mean, it would have been my second project rather than my first project, but it became my first project, right? And that was really exciting because when I was coming back, the first thing I did was to go and get this book on all the Buddhist association in Singapore, right? So then I start thinking where to go. I mean, that kind of stuff. Because, I thought, okay, when we're doing research, it's actually very important to start it right. And so when you go there, who would you meet under the first few very senior, very eminent monks that I met was people like, apart from Master Hong Chu Master, right? We have Venerable Shanghai, they were all very old at that time. And they kind of look at me, this little complicated. You're interested in Buddhism. So it's not that popular at that time for scholars actually to really seriously say, "I'm actually going to do this project, and this is actually my PhD project, you get me, and I really want to know ABCD, that kind of stuff." So that was the start. And then just to sort of add on to it, and also it's actually very interesting. And I have to say I'm very guilty because through the years, I mean, as an anthropologist, I sometimes feel like I shouldn't be making, overly tap on people's resources, because there were one whole group of very young monastic monks, right? It was in somewhere, I can't even remember the address, living in literally a hut, and it was very interesting, and I think they are now very eminent monks today as well. And that was at that time was very interesting, exciting, because you see, when we thought of the monastic, the sangha, in the early years, they always often talk about people are not very highly educated, so on and so forth. But this was actually the start of, those monks that I met, they were all very young, probably my age, all right, at that time, and they have just graduated from universities. So if I actually mention to you, you probably will know who they are. And just to mention one of them was actually telling me that, and that was also very interesting at that time. They were also telling me that there was a couple of them who were actually single, not so I said, what did they say? The only son, all right, the only son. And so to actually want to Jia, it's not going to be so easy if you are the only son, all right? And so they were also relating and telling me about how difficult it was actually to persuade their parents, because they really want their blessings before you Jia, right? And so there was one of these very interesting case studies that I encountered at that time, and sort of like through the years, right? Most of my academic careers are not spent here. In fact, I just came back a while ago, and what I find was when I came back, I saw this development, the vibrance of this. They have actually developed, since I talk about reformist Buddhism, and what I was looking at is that consolidation of a lot of activities and how the Sangha, the society, which is a community, comes together as well, right? So that's how I look at it. And of course, I'm so grateful to, Jack, or we call him, what do you call him? Prof Chia. Here we go. All right. Prof Chia. His word was so exciting. So I was very grateful that he actually asked me to read this book, all right, because I would have actually put it aside. I would have read it, but maybe not so soon, So what I really wanted, to sort of look at was, because in my book I talk about the tripartite relationship, right, of the state, society, and Buddhism, and how all these three acts together, right, to produce what we see today, and what I look at was, in Chia's book, in Prof Chia's book, right, I think it's outlined very clearly, right, the transformation of this, so what we call the popular Chinese religion, all right, and at that time, in fact, today you still hear the older generation, talking about Qin Fayin. All right, this is a very generic term that we hear it, perhaps among the younger, group here, students here, maybe your grandparents, your ama, your talk about bison. But whereas I think today, for the middle-aged group, right, you actually, they will be a bit more circumspective in using this term bison. Maybe they'll say you're Buddhist and you're Taoist and that kind of thing. So what Jack has done was to sort of, in all his chapters, I basically talk about the 10 core chapters, right? That he deal with the specific aspects of it. But of course, I'm not going to go through every chapter. He's given a very good introduction, and quite a lot of details. But what I really want to do is, because I thought I'm only given 10 minutes or 15 minutes to talk, right, is to actually outline some of the key points that I thought is very interesting and perhaps worth looking at even more, right? And particularly as I know, Prof has got a lot of students working on it as well. So let me start with, throughout, and you've heard from him, the role of the Sangha. I think Sangha is very important. I think he started by introducing, right, the historical background that lead to the development of reformist Buddhism, starting with particularly Taishin, right? And then of course his influence on socially engaged Buddhism. I think in this part of the world, I think sort of like it was a very early stage. And then during even my research, right, you find that there were a lot of small Buddhist fellowship groups that emerged. And I remember going to a lot of these different groups, which is just a group of people, no monks, nothing, but they were discussing a lot about Buddhism, right? And it's amazing, even during that period of time, you actually have English-speaking, English-educated Buddhists, because most of the time in the 80s, we tend to associate Buddhism with the Chinese educated group. English educated Christianity. It's like that kind of dichotomy was how it was looked upon in the early years. But today, I think it shifted quite a lot. So, we are talking about almost every Singaporean, more or less English educated. But in those days, it was very rare that you actually find that. And so that was actually quite exciting, because for me, so much easier. I don't have to keep thinking about terms in Chinese. My Chinese is not as good already at that time. So it started with that. And then, of course, when I was actually interviewing people like Shakai, all those very they were actually very exciting and very supportive of the different kinds of work that needs to be done. But also they are very pragmatic during those earlier years. That, of course, we know that we have to do all these different rituals, all right? Because the Chinese are very, very ritualistic, very individual. So in anthropology, right, we think rituals very important. But of course, in the early years, when you speak to a lot of people who are not part of the so-called popular Chinese religious scene, and then the very minute you mention about this ritual, that ritual, they will look at you, particularly among the Christians, this is superstition. All right. So in anthropology, we don't use terms like superstition. But yes, that was the kind of very value loaded term that we hear tremendously. So they were very important, I think, what Jack has mentioned, right, in his PhD speech about what they have done. So what he did was, in his book, and when we look at the book of Sangha, I kind of divided it into three main points. The first was the significance of the propagation of Buddhist Dharma. I think that was the initial start. And I believe even today, right, if you go and walk into any temple, you will be given a lot of all those little booklet, Buddhist booklets. I have stacks of them at home because every time I go to a temple, they say, this is free. Would you like to have some? Yes, I read everything, right? The first thing I asked is, how come you're so rich, to be able to print all these things? What do you think? These are all sponsored. Right? They're all really literally sponsored by people who are staunch believers, who believe, because publishing that booklet is how you create your fojiao. That your karma, and then the karmic field, you have to expand it. You cannot just like that, all right? So that's how they do. So in his book, he actually discussed, and it's scattered in all the different chapters, right, on the debates of what constitutes reformist Buddhism, socially engaged Buddhism, and what are the key teachings and practices, right, of reformist Buddhism. And specifically in chapter 8, Prof Jack examines the establishment of the Buddhist and Pali College of Singapore, and by Mangala Vihara. And that's also a very interesting case study because during my year while doing research here, Mangala Vihara is actually Theravada, but the whole group of them are Chinese. You actually are Chinese. And then when you talk to them, they'll tell you, we are Chinese, we're Parataka Chinese. Anyway, they are Chinese. And it's very interesting because although it's Theravada, but it's also a lot of the practices, there are some Mahayana influences in it as well. So I got to know the Bhante very, very well because, and so he really helps me and teaches me a lot of things as well. So in chapter 8, that's what he talks a little bit about that. But then I think one point that wasn't quite mentioned, or maybe I missed that point, was that I think from the 1970s through the 1980s until now, there was a lot of informal weekly Dharma classes that were conducted. Okay, so of course, a lot of all these, sometimes they don't have a name, but there are groups of people who are gathered together. So these are things I think that sows the seed of what I think reformist Buddhism, subsequently developed and become more institutionalized in that aspect. So today you have a lot of Buddhist fellowship groups. They actually have a name, they are registered. Right? So in the early years, we have some that are actually not registered, right? And of course, I think the fact that I think some of these dharmas were also conducted in vernacular languages as well, right? We have attracted a large group of not only the young but the older men and especially women as well, right? So that is one point that comes very clearly. And then the second point that I think when we talk about the role of the Sangha is the development of Buddhist welfare system. Jack mentioned about the welfare group by plenty of the other like the Xinjiapo with the meta enhancement. So you find that, but in his book, he talks about the role of Yanjiu and also Yanjiu involvement in the provision of healthcare as well, in the form of kidney dialysis. I mean, this is something that were actually very significant, very important in the early days, because I mean, you know, we have a lot of elderly people at that time who were suffering from kidney problems, and dialysis very expensive. All right, to get a dialysis machine at that time cost like 30,000. All right, that was very expensive. So you actually do need people to donate. So I always remember because since my mom was a Buddhist, my dad, my de facto becomes a Buddhist, and then my de facto, basically, my mom saying, oh, they need a machine at the center. So the right thing to do for all the debts that I know of, they take out the checkbook, write a check, $30,000 for one dialysis machine. I mean, those were the days, where we're actually looking at healthcare needs. And I think this is something that I think when I read a lot of this book, something that I feel that we didn't really dig as deep into it as we can. Maybe one of the students can start thinking about that as well. I think that's something that we can do. And of course, I think Jack mentioned about protecting the Dharma, so I don't have to repeat it here, right? So that's one aspect. So the role of Sangha. Then the second aspect is, I think in his book he also mentioned writes about Buddhist bureaucracy. So when we talk about reformist Buddhism and how the bureaucracy becomes very important. And I think he gave the example of the Buddhist college of Singapore. And then he had a very nice chart about, all the different divisions in that chart, right? You have the president and all these things. So I think this is actually very important in modern day Buddhist development. And I feel like I think Singapore started out there, it's caught on in many other regions as well, that the bureaucratization of the institution is important because it enables accountability. And particularly today, when you have the younger generation who are very happy to basically, transfer money through pay and whatever, right? I mean, there is something, but it's also accountability. Where do my money go, right? What do you do it for? And so when you have a bureaucratic structure that actually tells people very specifically, there are all these different divisions, and this is what they are doing, what they are for, right? That sense of accountability is important. And I think Jack in the book brought that up, and I think that is very important for us to know. And then the third big point that I'm going to finish very fast. I know she's looking at me. And then he speaks a bit longer, right? Then entitled to a few more minutes. The next, I think, important point that was brought up in the book is about Buddhist diplomacy. And of course, I think we know that it has been going on, for a long, long time, right? I mean, since last century, there has already been movement, and we talk about the network structures on and so forth. But actually, it's only very recently that people are actually looking at it more seriously and writing about it. So religious diplomacy hasn't really been written as much as you talk about religious pilgrimages. I mean, that has been written. That is also part of that kind of transnational network that we are talking about, but not in terms of diplomacy. And so the way I was looking at it, and of course, Jack also mentioned about it, and this is actually a very interesting point that he brought up in his book about the differences. The scholars do also look at the differences between the way I tend to look at it, right, is that when we look at spiritual diplomacy, I think it's more like people to people kind of relationship. Yeah, so you have Buddhist monks, religious personnel bringing their flock, okay, for maybe certain kind of religious experiences. Sometimes it's retreat, sometimes visiting the temple, a bit of pilgrimages. So those are for your own religiosity, development of your own spiritualism, so right. And then, of course, in this book, he actually talks about religious diplomacy as like bringing the whole group, all right, of people there. First, it's sort of like establishing the kind of relationship that need not necessarily be spiritual, but more as per, religious, because you want to establish the kind of contact, religious network and contact, right? So it is kind of like religious, not spiritual. You know what I mean? So there is a bit of the difference, which I thought was brought up, and then it's a very nice thing to actually look at, and perhaps we can actually bring a little bit more of that as well. Okay. So of course, the example that he actually gave was yes. So the point that I think Jack brought up about Hong Chuan Fashi bringing the ILO, the IRO group of religious leaders. I thought that was very interesting because it falls right into what the Singapore state wants when we talk about multiculturalism, multireligiosity, that kind of stuff. So that was actually a very interesting aspect that I don't think we see that in any part of the world. Okay, so then the other aspect of diplomacy is, I think, in his book, and I think Buddhist case study, right, is this transformation or movement from religious to cultural diplomacy. So I as you read that chapter, well, there's a lot of religious elements involved in it, but it's actually not religious. It's literally very cultural. So you're actually talking about museum hosting religious exhibits, for instance. And I thought this is an important aspect, when we look at how religion can become a conduit for cultural exchanges as well. So the museum, and I think the different government groups, I think it's the Shaanxi Provincial Government Cultural Affairs Bureau, has been doing that. So that is probably one point that I think is worth exploring further, and how it transforms itself. Okay, so I've got 2 more points to make, then I shut up. Okay. Another point that I think came out from this book is varieties, hybridization, adaptability, and acceptance. So in his case study, so let's talk about variety. Is that we look at the Buddhist scene in Singapore. There is the local element, but there is also the external influences that come in. Whether he likes it or not, Falun Buddhist Association is going to stay here, right? Or the other one would have Falun Gong. I think it's still around. Whether it's still or not, it's still around. And then of course there's Tzu, and then there's also the Sokogakai and all those groups, right? That work actually just started. Sokogakai just started in the 80s. When I first was doing it, they were in a very small apartment. Then they expanded, right? So from there we can see how these varieties and the adaptation to the local environment takes place. So that's something, and of course his example of this Buddhist death ritual it was very interesting because it also brought up the San Juan Jinsen, right? Where there was that hybridization of, it is Buddhist, but they introduced certain external elements into it. So the setup was slightly different, so on and so forth. So this brought me to this point about in the Singapore context, right? I think particularly in Buddhism, there is a high level of tolerance and acceptance. I mean, you can be from elsewhere, you can come, whether I would, actually embrace it or not is personal, but they, we don't talk bad about them, so I feel like in Singapore Buddhism is like that because right from the start, 40 years ago when I started my research, people were actually telling me, oh, we are very tolerant. I mean, because at that time there was also the evangelical groups, Christian groups coming, and there was this kind of Christian claims of modernity that was occurring, right? And there was some tensions, let's put it that way. But I think, what we see as we continue to see today is that level of acceptance. Okay, now I finished my, but I have just a couple of comments and future research ideas, right? I think one thing that comes across as I read the book was I've been thinking about gender, women. I mean, if you look at Buddhism, there's a lot of women involved in it. And actually, if you actually look at literature on the gender dimension, there are a few books written on that. All right, even up to today, I mean, these books, but not so many. And in the Singapore case, I also don't see that much. So that's probably an area which is very close to my heart, and I think it's worth exploring. So I'd like to encourage the students here, and probably Prof Chia to encourage students. So to actually, if you're interested in that area, because I believe there's a lot of work, a lot of material in that area. But it's actually worth exploring. That one. And then the other aspect, which is also very close to my heart, that I have just recently published a book on, is on Buddhist philanthropy, Buddhist compassion, Buddhist charity, Buddhist philanthropy. I think this is something that, of course, in my own book, I argue about the 21st century is the era of shared modernity. Right? I mean, you can read about it, what shared modernity is, but I think it's very important because, I mean, the way I look at it is that we are all very nice, very kind-hearted, all right? Except that a lot of times a lot of our values are buried right in our subterranean psyche level. It needs to be excavated out, right? And I think Buddhism or the other religions would help us to bring it out. And this is very much linked to the whole idea of how do we go about expanding charity? And I actually don't quite like the word charity because it gives that the other loaded dimension. But more, I would use the term passion as well as philanthropy. So that's something that we can all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof, for very insightful and thoughtful reflections. I really like your story as well. Right? I think it really, as you were sharing, I thought, it just actually comes full circle, isn't it? And thanks for the actually leads in terms of future research. So now I'd like to invite Associate Professor Koh Keng Wee, who is joining us live from Zhengzhou, China, via Zoom. So Prof Koh brings to the table his expertise on maritime trade, regional networks, and historical diaspora to engage with the themes that Prof Jack has just talked about in his book. So Keng Wee, are you online? Yeah, please. Good to see you. Over to you, Prof Koh.
Hello.
Hi.
I don't know whether you all can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Can you all hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Because I cannot really hear you guys. Oh yes, okay. Okay. Let me get what I was trying to. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if you can hear me, that's fine. So okay. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Natalie Pang, for the kind introduction. Right. Also, thank you, Jack, for thinking of me as one of the discussants on this panel over other much safer choices, alongside the very distinguished Prof Kwa, who has long inspired us with her work on Chinese religion, society, Buddhism, and I think now she's working on TCM. Correct me if I'm wrong. Thank Chai Kim and the colleagues also for putting this seminar together. So it's a great honor to be part of this discussion. And Jack, if I ever get elected abbot of Shaolin Temple, I'm sure you'll get a new Buddhist study center soon, and we'll both go and we'll both go to Lin's Kopi at CPIB very soon, and we can continue our academic discussions there, hopefully. Okay, anyway, I must say I'm not an expert in Buddhism or religious studies. In fact, I don't know what I'm an expert in, but anyway, I will focus mainly on the, I think, historiographical and historical significance of Jack's book, and also the context of his work, right? So I think this latest book in Chinese on Buddhism in Singapore it falls actually very much neatly within his broader approach to the study of Buddhism, and it reflects his own personal experience as well. So in a sense, his study is not just a study of Buddhism in Singapore, in modern Singapore and Southeast Asia, but also a long-term history of the religion, right? A modern history of the religion in wider maritime Asia, right? If we can use the term. So, because in terms of what has been done a lot for Buddhism today, Buddhism in recent history, in the past few decades, and also Buddhism as a whole. Of course, we have the earlier scriptural philosophical works, and more recently, we have a lot of anthropological, sociological studies, which tend to take a rather local and national approach to the study of these religions. Of course, Prof Kwa's work transcends these local and national frames, and so does Jack. And I think Jack's work, right, embodied in the essays included in this book and elsewhere, tries to transcend these constraints of place, the scope of research and all that. And for him, right, I think you can see how migration, mobility, in a sense, they're quite different, and modernity, right? It's a three very important recurrent themes in his work, right? So in a sense, his earlier monograph entitled Buddhism in Motion, Monks in Motion, sorry, got the name wrong. In his focus on the mobilities of the monks between China and Southeast Asia and their role in the modernization of Buddhism in the region and in the promulgation of Buddhist modernities and Buddhist perspectives in Asian modernities, I think it is a very interesting fit into a wider range of Buddhist literature that has looked at the history of Buddhism in the long term, and which I think since work in the 90s have began to look at mobility, migration, but rather than just scripture and all that. So, for example, I mean, if you look at the work of Professor Tan Sen Sen on Buddhist diplomacy networks in medieval, early maritime Asia and Blackburn in the early modern period, and also the colonial period. I mean, there are quite a few, but I'll just name like the works of Sean McHale in terms of pre-modernities in colonial Vietnam, a lot of which was actually religious and Buddhist driven. And so, and then the more recent work on reformist Buddhism, Chinese religion, ancestral worship, right? And in this transnational context by Professor Hua, you can see how, in a sense, Jack's work fits into this broader development that has been going on for the last few decades, in which mobility, transnationalism, and modernism becomes very important themes, right? So, and more recently, we can see that also developing in the history of Taoism in the works of Vincent Rosat, Kenneth Dean, and others in the field. So what I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to sort of highlight the context for his latest book that we are discussing today, which actually takes us in a way away, not totally away, but away from this broader macro view of the history of Buddhism in Malaysia, Asia, to the history of Buddhism in Singapore, but also to his more personal experience. So, in a sense, this book is not just a history of Buddhism in Singapore or Southeast Asia. It is also a history of how a Buddhist scholar, how someone from within the Buddhist community developed as a scholar. Right? It's a reflection of his past as a historian of Buddhism, embedded and actively involved in the Buddhist community in Singapore over the past few decades, and a survey of the different contextual and local trends shaping and defining Buddhism in Singapore. In this, if we can use the word long, I don't know, ever since, who was the one who started using long? Long 20th century, long 18th century, long 17th century. So we have this long 20th century in which I encapsulated in this most current book, right, on Buddhism in Singapore, right. So it also shows, in a sense, how as someone from the community, as a devotee, as a ritual practitioner, member of Buddhist youth groups, chanting groups, right, he, in a sense, has also written a sort of macro history that transcends his own experience. And that's, I think, something that is very important in terms of this book, and which I'll come back to at the end, because it serves as a very important inspiration for many future scholars who work from their own fields, not only from just Buddhist. Within the Buddhist community, we can talk about Islam, we can talk about Christianity, we can talk about Taoism, right? But there's a lot to learn. So basically, I think the analysis in his book, right, I know he has gone through the themes and Prof has also discussed. So if you bear with me, I just go through my own reading, right? So I see a very interesting pattern to the chapters in this book, because in a sense, his book begins from where he left off with Monks in Motion, right? In which he discusses Buddhist connections across the South China Sea in the first half of the 20th century. And in a sense, what's very interesting is that it's not only like how Singapore Buddhism is located within a broader regional maritime context and mobility context, but in terms of the genealogical approach, right? I mean, what Jack wrote in his book, and he highlighted earlier in his discussion, in his lecture, you can lay out the genealogies, the connection, teacher-disciple connection, and movement alongside a Sufi, a history of Sufism in Singapore. And you see not the same people, but the same type of genealogies of transmission, right? And maybe we can also see the same in Theravada schools, in even charismatic Christian lineages, and I think that is what is also very important about his book, right? It also tells us a lot about what can we do in terms of studying other religions, and what can we do when we study Buddhism or a particular religion, how much we can gain by, looking at other religions, right? So, and from there, right, what's interesting is that he shifts towards a more focused examination of Buddhism in Singapore, in terms of the historical overview of Chinese Buddhism in Singapore, the beginnings of a humanistically engaged Buddhism, which overlaps with the Reform movement, and the shift from the association of death rituals into how Buddhism, how the younger members of the community, and also, like Jack mentioned, authority figures within the Buddhist community encourage going back to the scriptures and going back to look at how that, in a sense, how we can, how they feel they can reach a purer form of the religion, a more correct form of the religion. And I think, in a sense, from what I know, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, in that sense, these are also processes you yourself went through, right, as a Buddhist, from when you were in JC and then perhaps even till now, right? So I think this also it's very local. It highlights the themes that were happening in Singapore Buddhism at that time. It's, I think, also perhaps very personal. But what's interesting for me is also, again, when you look at what was happening in Buddhism during this period, and then you look at the Dharma movement, you look at the new Christian charismatic movements, the new movements, right, turning to scripture, right, in a sense, if you look at the longer history of religion perspective, from the perspective of Christianity, you see the Protestant, the Protestant turn, right? The sort of turning to scripture, understanding, interpreting, and applying to their everyday lives. It seems that something was happening in Buddhism, which was also happening in the others, right? So, again, from your study, we can see, in a sense, how it's not only about a more transnational approach, but also how interreligious approach, right, would be very interesting, right? And in a sense, it also, like you mentioned, coincided with the more global transnational approach to Buddhism, right? Stronger networks with overseas, more Taiwanese movements coming here and then reaching out, which also coincided with increasing westernization in Singapore, linguistic changes, language changes, changes in the Chinese communities. So, yeah, so anyway, because I think all this has been mentioned before, so I think for me, the discussions of these chapters actually deal not only with something very local and very personal for you, but also something that is part of a broader trend of societal changes in Singapore at that time. I think this has been raised before in sociology and anthropology and history as well. So, but that's my reading. So, what's the other interesting thing is that from there, right, the chapters in your book, in a sense, bring us to another direction, which preempts your upcoming works on diplomacy, Buddhism, in which you talk about the travels of Hong Chuan Fa Shi, like Master Hong Chuan, from Singapore to China, how in a sense, the diplomatic significance of his visits, and then the final chapter, not the final chapter, I think the penultimate chapter, in which you talk about the collaboration between Chinese museums and ACM in terms of Buddhist relics, exhibitions, and all that, as well as your chapter on Buddhism during the COVID period in Singapore, right, in which you deal with another dimension of this transnational experience of Buddhism, in which new technologies allow us to virtualize rituals, create new types of communities, and in a sense, broadcast things and share things in a way previously impossible, right? So yes, so ultimately, right, I think this book for me, right, is a very important collection of essays on the history of Buddhism in Singapore, emphasizing the need to look at the transnational context and the local changes going on in Singapore society, Singapore Chinese society. There's also a very good example of how someone can write about his own religion and culture, right? So I think there's a famous video online by M.N. Srinivas in one of the classes of Jack Goody, in which he talked about how when one works on culture, especially one's own culture, right? Actually, he was talking more about other cultures, but he talks about how a researcher often, to do research, to understand the culture, he has to be thrice born. So he's speaking on Hindu, the Brahmin idea of being twice born. So he talks about how first you have to sort of, in a sense, the first birth is like being born as one of the disciplines, right? And then in trying to study a culture, going to a culture and understanding it, you immerse yourself in that culture, and that's in like you are reborn again. And then he said that the most important part was also the third birth, the third rebirth, in which you have to pull yourself out of the immersion, create the distance, and then to analyze things from there, to see possibilities, research possibilities from there. I think in this work, you have showed us how someone from within religious culture, community, religion can also do an excellent macro study and an in-depth study and very sophisticated study of the religion, in this case Buddhism, in Singapore, in its broader transnational context. Sorry, that's it. Thank you, everybody.
I hope you can hear me. I really enjoy your discussion of how the scholarship can be embodied, right, in the researcher. So actually on this note, we are running short of time, so I'm gonna just ask for everyone's understanding. We're gonna push the Q&A to the end, right to the end. So on this note, I'd like to invite my colleague Chai Kim to come up here to share just for 5 minutes, right, on our collection. Good afternoon, everyone. NUS Library is home to a rich and diverse special collection of Buddhist studies in Singapore. This include both English and Chinese sources. Our collections covers the history of local Buddhist institutions, the lives and contributions of venerables, and the growth of scholarship on Buddhism in Singapore and South Asia. Many of these works are unique and not easily available elsewhere, spanning from the 1940s to the present. Broadly, our collection can be grouped into primary and secondary sources. Primary sources include journals and magazines published by associations and societies, biographies and memoirs of venerables, and anniversary or commemorative publications issued by temples, associations, and schools. This provides first-hand perspective and records of Buddhist community in Singapore. Secondary resources include scholarly monographs and edited volumes, historical and cultural studies, and books examining Buddhism's role in Singapore society. This helps us integrate and contextualize the primary materials within broader academic and social framework. To illustrate these resources, let me share 3 highlights from our collections. Our first highlight is Nanyang Fojiao or Nanyang Buddhist, a bilingual periodical that has been in continuous publication since 1969. The library hosts a complete collection starting from its very first issue. In 1990, from issue 250 onwards, it became the official publication of the Singapore Buddhist Federation. In 2019, a special issue number 507 marked both the Federation's 70th anniversary and 50 years of the magazine. Today, Nanyang Buddhist stands as the longest running Buddhist periodical in Singapore. It covers local and overseas Buddhist entities as well as articles on Buddhist thought and literature, making it a valuable resource for tracing the growth of Buddhism both in Singapore and the region. Next is a tribute to Master Hong Chun, a commemorative volume containing his biography, tribute articles, and newspaper clippings. It reflects on his leadership, contributions to Buddhist education, and the growth of Buddhism in Singapore, preserving his legacy for future generations. Our third highlight is the Silver Jubilee commemorative magazine of the Singapore Buddhist Law, published to mark its 25th anniversary. This commemorative volume is especially rich in content, recording the association's activities,
milestones and achievements over the years. It also provides detailed descriptions and portrait images of the lodge, management, and its key leaders, offering important insights into the organization and leadership of Singapore's Buddhist communities in the mid-20th century. As such, it serves as both a historical record and a valuable research resource to understand Buddhist community in Singapore. Beyond printed materials, our collection also includes digital resources such as the database of classical poetry in Singapore. Established in 2020 by Dr. Dongnanya, the database features notable Nanyang poets and draws from sources such as local newspapers, magazines, and books. It includes a section on Buddhist poems, highlighting the intersection of literature and Buddhism in Singapore. From the section of Buddhist poems, we can find poets with close ties to Buddhism in Singapore. For instance, Li Chun-seng, a businessman and philanthropist, was a major supporter of Buddhist institutions and activities. Master Tai Shi, the reformist monk, made several visits to Singapore and left a lasting influence on the local Buddhist community. And Hu Shu Wan, one of Singapore's most renowned poets, expressed Buddhist themes in his poem. Their presence in the database show how literature and Buddhism intersect within Singapore's cultural history. To conclude, I would like to highlight Digital Gems, which is a gateway to our digitized, rare, and special collection, including books, manuscripts, newspapers, photographs, and maps. Highlights include Chinese historical materials on Southeast Asia and nearly 200 digitized newspapers in English, Chinese, and Malay. Together, all these print and digitized resources not only document both the history and development of Buddhism and local communities in Singapore, but also the wider cultural heritage of the region. We hope this brief showcase has given you a sense of the breadth and depth of our collections, and we warmly invite you to explore further through the curated book display after the event.
In the interest of time, I think we only have time for just one question.
Probably we can collect a few questions and
Yeah.
answer just one at one go.
Q&A. Questions, anyone? Or comments?
Yeah.
Or if not,
I got a question about I'm very interested about how the Falun Gong sort of put in this kind of scope of how Buddhism was understood, because Falun Gong himself claimed himself as Buddhist, right? But how is Buddhist, like Buddhist historian or Buddhist studies, how we should understand their role and their presence within this Buddhist landscape?
That's right. And other questions.
not maybe just a very quick response.
Yes.
We know that the origin of Buddhism is India, and Indian Emperor Ashoka sent many missions to Southeast Asian nations like Bangladesh, Thailand, Myanmar, and all this. So, is there any presence of influence of Indian Buddhism in Singapore Buddhism?
Yes.
That is my one question. In one of your recent article, you consider Buddhism in Singapore is compared to a hard rivalry between India and Chinese Buddhism in terms of diplomacy. So, what is the position of Singaporean Buddhism?
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for the question. Very good response to you, Brian. Thanks for the question about Falun Gong. So usually Falun Gong, for scholars of religion, they usually study them as a kind of new religion, rather than as part of Buddhism. But because in the Singapore context, if you register a religious organization in Singapore, your organization must be a religion that falls within the 10 major religions in Singapore. And Falun Gong itself is not a category. So that's, of course, in fact, the reason why we registered as a Buddhist organization. And thanks very much for your question about Indian connection. So we can look at the kind of Indian Buddhist connection in the pre-modern period and also in the modern contemporary period. So think about Singapore and the kind of pre-modern Indian Buddhist connection. It actually goes all the way back to the early Hindu Buddhist kingdom in maritime South Asia. And of course, Singapore was a part of, we think about the kind of broader regional context, where it was part of Srivijaya kingdom, and then later on that part of the Majapahit kingdom, right? So during that time, Singapore then was part of this Hindu Buddhist kingdom in pre-modern South Asia. They had connection with India, the kind of early modern, not modern, but pre-modern esoteric form of Hindu Buddhist kind of culture, right? So which is a pre-modern period. But during the modern period, there was this attempt by the Buddhist community in East Asia, but also in fact in South Asia, to trace the Buddhist history and connection with India. And that was also, we saw the revival of Buddhism in India in the modern period, like Buddhist reformers such as the Ambedkar or like the Dharmapala, right? Those were very prominent Buddhist reformers in modern India. And there were Buddhists from Japan, China, and even South Asia. And one of them was actually Li Chun-sing that we mentioned earlier. He actually made a trip from Singapore to India. He actually left a very extensive record, and it's actually on display here. So he actually talked about his travel account in India, but also the attempt by Buddhists during the modern period to actually search for, this is what Professor Richard Jack, right, in his recent book called Seeking Sakyamuni, right, to actually try to seek the Buddha, to look for the Buddha back in his historical homeland. So I think this is also an area that really deserves more scholarly attention to think about the kind of global kind of Buddhist connection, but also the attempt to like revive and reclaim Buddhism, right, from this like homeland. Yeah. So I think with that, thanks so much for the questions, and thanks so much for joining us for the group discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Probably today I more time for Q&A. So maybe I will hand over the time to Brian. So we just have a short.
So yeah, we come to the end of this seminar, and a big thank you to all our speakers, Professor Chia and Professor Huang and Professor Ko on Zoom, as well as the moderator, Professor Pang, for a wonderful and engaging seminar. So I would like to Professor Pang to come to the stage in front, present tokens of appreciation to our speakers, and we will hand over the token of appreciation to Professor Ko when he's back to Singapore. So please, Professor Chia. And we also would like to take a quick photo of this. You have me out. It's
a special edition.
Wow.
That's on the stamps.
Oh, and the history timeline.
Highlighting our muscle. Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for all the predicted bring out. Thanks so much.
Yeah.